They're estimating based off of that sample that they could expect to see as many as 18,000 new unrecorded archaeological sites in the Amazon basin. Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Harenstein. With me, as always, is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today, we're super excited because we get to start a new book. Our last one was a lot of fun, but a bit of a deviation from our typical books because we're doing a fiction murder mystery, but still lots of great archaeology to talk about. But today, we are starting off with the new book, Archaeology from Space by Sarah Parcak. You may be a little bit familiar with this name and this person. She was very popular on various shows for a while. She did a TED Talks. You can check that out. But I know she was on some like late night interviews and stuff as well about the work she does.
Yeah.
And actually, we'll talk about this when it comes up a bit later, the next episode too. But some of her work was mentioned in a book we read called Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries. That was actually one of the things I talked about in chapter 6. So without further ado, let's jump right in. And we start off strong with an archaeology pun. My life is in ruins. Which, all right, I feel like we're in good hands here.
Yeah. And I feel like that's a common sentiment among many archaeologists.
Dumb puns, yeah, that's something we definitely can do.
Ruins is a good one, and also like the dig it ones.
Yeah.
That's another good common archaeology pun.
Oh, yes, the dig it. We've never used anything like that.
No, never.
It's not in our tagline or anything. But yeah, this introduction just kind of gets us started, get to know her a little bit better and the style, what she's going to be doing. How she got started in archaeology is a big part of this chapter.
Yeah.
Which isn't a bad place to start.
And it's a pretty common refrain with archaeologists, right? You have Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indy.
Which is how she started.
Which, yeah.
As a kid. Yep.
Common. Any archaeology conference, you'll find somebody who has the same story.
Yep, for sure. And we still get a lot of people asking if that's how we got started, which is interesting to me because I liked Indiana Jones, but it wasn't what caused me to want to be an archaeologist.
Yeah, same. But I did like the movie.
Yeah.
But I think I liked it more for the adventure and stuff than I did. I mean, obviously the archaeology is horrible, but as a kid, I didn't know that.
You didn't know that. And then a lot of the credit for what got her really started goes to Grampy, which this sounds kind of nice.
I know. It's very wholesome.
Yeah. So she spent a lot of times with grandparents, especially the grandfather. And he was a high-tech nerd of his day, basically.
Right. Yeah.
He was in World War II. And I forget what they said he was doing.
He was in the Army's 101st Airborne.
Yeah, he was a paratrooper.
Yeah. And he would use maps and stuff to plot coordinates.
Aerial photos, cutting-edge tech of the time.
Yeah.
And so after the war, he got a PhD in forestry and then used that technology for forestry purposes and like pioneered a lot of the forestry uses for the technology.
Yep.
Very cool.
Which I thought was really neat because I used my last job. We did a lot with like the Forest Service and different large land managing agencies, and we used aerial photography for like maps and things. And I was like, oh, I have a kind of a connection to Grampy too.
Yeah.
You know?
She kind of got interested in this and using it for archaeology. And it says she assumed that it would be a fully well-researched and explored area, and it absolutely was not, because we don't have money, and technology is not always our forte either.
Yeah.
This is less true now than it was, but it used to be all about the mechanical skills, I'd say.
And I feel like archaeologists were there was some hesitancy to adopt certain technologies just because they were utilized by people who were doing the exact opposite of what we wanted to do a lot of times.
Yeah.
Like think metal detectors and stuff like that.
There are still archaeologists who will not use metal detectors because metal detectorists use it to loot sites, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because they'll use shovels still. They use shovels and anyway.
Right.
I didn't pick up that from this story, or at least when she started, she didn't seem to think that was how people were using it, but I definitely could see that be an issue.
Yeah. Well, and now with like, I think she talked a little bit about like how now like a lot of this imagery is pretty widely available, and so it does get utilized for nefarious purposes.
Exactly. There's a pretty great story about Harrison Ford, meeting Harrison Ford.
Yeah, which is pretty cool.
I liked it. She got to have dinner with him and geek out about her work and stuff with him. And
she brought a fedora.
I love that he said that she could get away with it. And then apparently she has a photo of her fighting over the fedora with Harrison Ford.
Yeah, priceless.
priceless.
I do like how he was like, you do know that was just a character I was playing, right?
Yeah.
Be like, no, that was not just a character.
No.
You're indie. I don't care what you say.
But this was a pretty good example of archaeologists as nerds, because
Yep.
I don't know that there's many out there that wouldn't think that was a pretty cool photo to have.
Right. Yeah.
And then finally, we get a little bit about space archaeology. And so she specifically says she left this section to write to the very, very end of the book because she wanted to have the most up-to-date stuff at the time, which is interesting because basically that's her indicating to us how quickly things are moving with this.
Right.
Specifically, satellite technology has really increased how quickly we can identify new sites. And we got a fair amount of this from the Lost City of the Monkey God as well. And we'll hear about some of those sites once again.
Yeah, we do.
Not the one they did in Lost City of the Monkey God so far, thank goodness.
No.
But there's also, she points out in this, and we'll see this throughout the book so far, at least as far as I've read, that the satellite imagery is only the first step.
Right.
And then you need to do ground truthing. Once again, this is a concept we talked about in the Lost City of Monkey God.
I do like that she mentions it's not just about finding new sites, but also like overturning long-held assumptions that we have for sites that have already been at least partially investigated.
I'd say that's archaeology in general.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people, when they think like, oh, satellite imagery, we're going to find all these new sites, and they don't realize like archaeology is kind of a continuous thing. Just because we excavated a site doesn't mean we never go back to that site or the data from that site and never reevaluate. And I think it's really important for people to understand that. I know I've said this in other episodes as well, like changing opinions, changing theories, changing hypotheses, all that stuff is not a weakness of science. It's a strength of science.
It is science working as intended.
Right. As we learn more, things change, and that is okay.
Yep. I think we talked about that a lot in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries in particular.
Yeah.
And then just one example of some of the groundbreaking new work that people found at the last minute before this book was published. In the Amazon basin, they did a study where they found 81 new pre-Columbian sites. And then they're estimating 1,300 from about 1200 to 500 AD. And then they're estimating based off of that sample that they could expect to see as many as 18,000 new unrecorded archaeological sites in the Amazon basin.
Pretty cool.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
Yes. And we're looking at, maybe more than 1 million people, ceremonial centers, mounds, platforms, fortified settlements, all kinds of different things. And this is a search that took, the months rather than decades.
Right.
Which is one of the key aspects of this technology.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty wild number, isn't it? To be able to find that much. And how would you select what to study next, I wonder? That's an overwhelming number of new sites.
Yeah. I guess it would depend on your research question.
Probably
it
the
could
most
be
threatened.
a geographic region.
Yeah.
It could be
The most threatened, probably.
Yeah.
But quick aside, if you know someone who is interested in hidden history and space science and has a commute, send them this episode. We think they'll like it. And then she has one little ending here with mentioning how popular understanding is still lacking, which is a really strange story to me. She was getting travel insurance to go to a site or a conference or something, and the travel insurance was astronomical because for some reason they thought she was going into space and getting into the satellites to look down on the Earth.
Which, yes, that's just something anybody can do.
And I'm just like, in this day and age of the internet, a company couldn't do better than that?
Yeah, it was
That is
like
wild.
over $50,000 for travel insurance.
That is,
I mean, at least now we know what it would cost for travel
Right.
insurance to go to space. $50,000. Okay. So funny.
oh boy. But moving on to chapter 1. This is a little more, I think, so the first one was kind of introducing us to who she was.
Right.
This one's a little more basic archaeology introduction, getting some of those essential concepts in there, I think.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of what was discussed in this chapter throughout our podcast, we've kind of discussed it in bits and pieces throughout a
Right.
bunch of other.
Which is fair. If you're writing an archaeology book, you need to do some of this.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. So I know some of this might sound like reiterating stuff people have already heard before on this podcast, but I think it's important stuff to reiterate.
Yeah.
So,
And we're just going to not talk about it verbatim. We're going to talk about bits and pieces of it.
yeah.
I thought it was interesting already. So an interesting thing that we need to understand is that she's an Egyptologist.
Yes.
And I think we're going to find that carries with it a pretty dramatically different experience with archaeology than you or I have.
And it's weird to me that, like, even at the beginning when I learned that, I was like, oh, she's a Egyptologist? And then why is she calling herself a space archaeologist? I had like
Mhm.
that reaction, which shows how I think of Egyptology as such a different, very specific branch of
Yeah.
archaeology.
And it almost carries a different, like, populist archaeology,
Yeah.
not rooted in the best of science. And that's not fair to the people who do the work, but that is how people seem to engage with it most of the time, I would say.
Well, and like most people who like in the U.S., a lot of people like the Egyptology studies are in the classics department.
Yeah.
They're not actually in like the anthropology or archaeology department, depending on what university. But a lot of
Right.
times it's in the classics.
And I've gotten the questions, and I'm sure you have, Barbara, if I've been to Egypt, as if all you do in archaeology, you must be going to Egypt.
Right. So it is funny how we think of Egyptology is so different, but the general public, that's what they think of when they think of archaeology.
And I think we get a little bit of a example of the difference right from the get-go, because she, at this point, had been through at least some schooling in college.
Yeah.
And she says her first time seeing ancient ruins was in 1999 when she saw the pyramids of Giza.
Right.
Like, there's no way you didn't see ancient ruins before. You just don't qualify them as ancient ruins.
Right. Yeah.
Right? That's got to be what's going on there, because, I mean, you drive down the highway and you'll see like ruins of old barns and stuff, and they could be around for 150 years, and that's
ancient by U.S. standards.
That's ancient by some standard. It's maybe not what you're personally into, but it's worth acknowledging that they are still ancient ruins. So I thought, oh, that's an interesting position already.
Well, and even like the Native American mounds, like,
right,
those
are ancient ruins.
Yeah. But I do like her discussion on like how there's no typical archaeological site. Each one is unique. Each one presents unique challenges, even within the same country, even within the same like county or city. There's no typical site that's going to be, there's no template.
Right.
And I think that's really important for people to understand, especially when doing archaeology. It's not like, even though we do it systematically, each one is its own problem to tackle, essentially.
And each one can inform other ones, but they're all going to be different still, because humans are complicated, my mantra.
Right.
She mentions a cluster of arrowheads can be a site.
Right.
Which I would even, if I'm trying to draw this example like she was, like, more fewer objects or less interesting objects, in air quotes here, are still a site. I would even do like a scattering of flakes from those arrowheads.
Yeah.
Or even, I would go more recent to add a little more contrast, a can dump. That's something we saw out west quite a lot, as people throughout the last several hundred years would go out and dump cans out in the wilderness. And always people hated going across them, but they're important parts of understanding that community.
I also like her analogy, and when she talks about how sites are not static, they're like film strips throughout time.
Yeah, that's actually
I thought that was a really good analogy that I hadn't really heard before.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for people to understand too, because I think a lot of people think of sites kind of stagnant. Once they're created, then they just kind of sit in this like little time capsule.
Well, and they're created in a flash, and then they're there. Right. Whereas actually they were created over 1,000 years.
Right. And then somebody else came along and built upon that site, and so on and so forth.
And even though no one's been there for another 1,000 years, there are still changes that are happening in that site.
And I mean, you can argue too, and I think she does, like even looting of a site becomes part of that site's identity and history, and it's important to understand that aspect of it too, as detrimental as it is.
Well, especially on the scale it's happening. That's the real issue with it.
Yeah.
We come back to Pompeii again, which is actually a good illustration, because this is something that we talked about in Four Lost Cities a fair bit in particular, but it's been other books too. And people picture this as a snapshot.
Right.
But again, in reality, it's not only not a snapshot, but it's also not a complete picture.
Right.
Because as she points out, the people are missing. The life, the activity, all the things that were going on day to day there are missing from that place. And that's true.
Even if you do think of it as a snapshot, it's not a typical snapshot. These are people that were running for their lives, literally.
Or most of them were gone already.
Yeah. So anything you see there is not a typical day or whatever,
right.
So I think that's important to remember too. Like, it's cool, but it's
you can get at some more typical day stuff there because things were abandoned so quickly.
And they were so well preserved.
Right. So you can get a bit more there than normal, but still, it's not the same.
Yeah.
Even shipwrecks, people talk about them as being a snapshot. And it's like, no, it's really not still.
Right.
Again, it's more so than the 1,000-year-long lived on site, but it's still definitely a film strip, shorter film.
Yeah. And then we talk a little bit about bioarchaeology, getting to know people by their bones, which is always a fascinating study and a specialization within archaeology itself.
I thought that was very interesting, but I thought I wanted just a little bit more typically than she was covering here. You know, like she mentioned like teeth and just kind of lists teeth and then makes a joke about paleo diet.
Which I always get. But
yeah,
yes.
I appreciate it in general. But then I was like, well, we get so much about what about teeth, right? That question was left unanswered, and it was frustrating a little bit. Even though I know the answer is like in the enamel or in the wear patterns can tell us a lot about. I wanted a little bit more sometimes in this than I was getting.
Yeah, as an aside, I'm currently reading a book by a bioarchaeologist, but it goes into a ton of detail. So like when I was reading this, I think I was having a hard time. Like as we're talking about it now, I'm like, oh gosh, what was in what book? So I'm gonna have to take your lead, Tristan. But yeah, I feel like, you know, it's just a general overview though. I mean, the whole book is about space archaeology, right? She's just trying to give in one chapter.
I didn't expect a lot more. Just, you know, I guess sometimes I feel with this book, I get teed up with a question and then the question is entirely unaddressed.
Yeah.
And that frustrates me. I doesn't necessarily expect her to like deviate the whole book and talk about this, but, you know, say, hey, we can look at the enamel and learn these things. That would have made me feel a little better with that. But anyway.
But she also talks about experimental archaeology, which is
experimental archaeology
cool.
is wonderful.
And I know we've talked about that in the past too, but recreating past technologies today to kind of see how they worked, how they were made, all that kind of stuff, what kind of labor was involved. A lot of people do this with, and I think she mentions flint napping.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty common one that I am not good at, but but also, I mean, we've had students at FSU who recreated a dugout canoe using tools that would have been available at the time. But it helps us as archaeologists kind of understand the processes.
And then I feel like there's just kind of a listing of different specialties.
Yeah. Have you heard of cognitive archaeology before? That was one that I was like, oh, never heard of this.
But again, I wanted a little bit more from these, right? Rather than just like they got each a sentence or something almost.
Yeah, it felt like at the end of the chapter, she was just kind of rushing through it.
Yeah. And I had that moment of what is the point of this?
Yeah.
And I think the idea is she's trying to illustrate the variety of specialties.
Yeah. Archaeologists are splitters, not lumpers. Right. As I always tell people.
But it seems to be a trend as well that I have to kind of think, okay, why I have to figure out what the point of something is.
Yeah. She talks a little bit about like the different tech. I think in this chapter she talks about magnetometry, which I don't know if we've talked about magnetometry before.
I'm certain it's come up.
Yeah. I feel like it has to have coring.
Mm-hmm. You know, and we'll see some of this throughout the book.
Yeah.
At least so far. And then we end with a little bit of a historical fiction piece on an Egyptian town that's about to be raided. And then we get to kind of the archaeology that led to some of that understanding. And essentially, there's a small group that was going to raid it and attack it. This was towards the end of an Egyptian era. I forget exactly.
There's like 50 million of them.
There's 50 million of them. But what somebody apparently did was raided the temple and then took the effigies of the gods on top of the temple wall and lit them on fire and at some point kicked them down. And then that fire heated up the bricks and caused the wall to collapse.
Right.
Which is fascinating that we can get that whole sequence of events.
Yeah.
Right? That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. It's also interesting to me. I like the environmental kind of history of the Nile Delta and how there are all these different branches and it took all these different paths throughout time and how it reminded me a lot of Four Lost Cities and the fact that when we see a site, it's even though the environment now can look so completely different from what it looked like in the past, and you know the rivers change routes and things.
And here's a pretty dramatic example of how environmental changes can lead to problems for a civilization, right? Because this city used to be extremely swampy,
right?
And it was not navigable for a lot of the year,
and then
it was getting wetter, and so those places were now navigable, and these guys could actually attack them.
Right.
via boat for the first time.
Right. So, again, not being an Egyptologist or knowing only what I learned in like elementary and middle school about Egypt, I was like, oh, wow, this is really fascinating.
Yeah.
It was more like a closer look than like, I feel like a lot of times we learn about Egypt, we get this like overall kind of overarching survey of Egypt, and to see like this one very specific site and how that environment shaped what happened to that site was really cool.
Yeah. We also get a very nice description of how they went about locating and investigating the site. In particular, I noted that at one point they were taking 2 sets of ladders 4 meters down into a hole, which I'm really hoping they had the safety that they need to have
OSHA, where
for
are
that.
you?
Well, OSHA only works in America.
I know, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't mean that they weren't safe. They could have fortified it and everything, but
I'm
I know
sure.
that I have seen it happen where people are digging way deeper than they should be.
Yeah.
So I had some thoughts on the book at this point, Barbara.
Okay.
I think we'll talk about this some more too, but it felt very disjointed to me.
Yeah, I feel like, by this point, obviously we'd only read the first chapter, but it wasn't what I expected.
Right.
And it felt like a little bit all over the place.
Yeah. And like I said before, I had to do a lot of like, why are we hearing about this? What is this? How does this tie to anything else we're talking about?
Yeah.
And sometimes I could come with an answer, but I had to think about it, or sometimes I don't know that I could.
I do appreciate, though, at least the stories, even if they were like tangential, were interesting.
Right. Yeah, no, it was not a bad read, but when I'm reading it the way we do for this podcast, I found it a little difficult to follow along.
Right. And I was always like constantly questioning, like, okay, what's the meat here? Like what's the substance that I need to get at for our podcast? Like, what are the discussion points essentially?
Mm-hmm. All right, chapter 2. So now we move on to space archaeology itself. I note she talks about how archaeology uses a lot of modern technology, which it does, and that's a thing we've been trying to tell people about for a long time.
Yep.
So we start this one off about a project she got involved in 99 in Egypt. And I have observed right away that there's a lot of focus on finding the intact thing.
Which I think you get more of in Egypt. Like, I feel
right,
like,
but that's not... I want to say that's not archaeology, but that's not like the broken thing in pieces is just as valuable to us as archaeologists as the intact thing.
Well, I mean, I feel like that is, I mean, obviously I've only done archaeology here and then in China, but when I was in China, like they were tossing broken stuff aside because they get so much stuff that is either whole or almost completely whole that it's just like, why study the pieces when you have the thing already articulated?
That's true. She didn't really specify that was the reason, but that could be what's going on here.
Because it was hard for me because I had been working with a CRM firm part-time and I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. Well, I've heard that's a thing in other places too.
Yeah, so I'm almost wondering, it would be interesting if there's archaeologists from outside of the United States that are listening to this podcast. We would love to hear like what your experience is with this, because it might be a United States thing. I don't know. But I could even see like in Europe where they might have more complete objects. I mean, obviously the pieces still have value, but I think maybe when you're finding, it would be like us finding a whole bunch of broken sand-tempered plain ceramics and then finding like complete sand-tempered plain pots.
Yeah. Yeah. And I get it that we don't collect everything either, because we don't collect all the brick that we come across because we just don't have the space for it, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we end this little section with another little historical fiction part about a potter and leaving fingerprints in the ceramics.
Yeah.
I think this is interesting because we've seen other authors tackle this using some historical fiction to help illustrate the things. And I think there's been some where I wanted a little bit more of it. I think 9 Lives of Florida's Key Marco Cat, I wanted a little bit more of this sort of a thing. I think the best example of using this effectively has to be the Other Ancient Civilizations.
Yeah.
Where in that case, we started off every chapter with one of these. And I think one of the reasons that it elevates in my mind a little above this is because it's always the beginning of the chapter.
It sets the stage.
It sets the stage, and you can't mistake it for fact.
Right. Yeah.
But when it's buried in the chapter, there's a little bit of a risk. I don't think she's falling prey to that here, but it just is a little more risky, I think.
Right.
But we get stories, not things. Thank you.
I do think this is when I start to see a very distinct difference in the way she and maybe maybe her colleagues, just from her experience in the field she works in, approach fieldwork very differently than us. And I think she has a very different view of maybe a little bit more narrow view of how archaeologists kind of exist in the world.
Yeah.
I feel like she was thinking of all archaeologists kind of work in this like academic setting where we're fighting for grants and we're working, during a field season and stuff like that. Whereas, and this is where I first started to kind of see that trend where a lot of archaeologists aren't even doing research, right? They're doing cultural resource management, working in that.
Which has research in it, but they're not doing research for the sake of research.
Right.
That's the important distinction.
So I feel like she's just coming from a very different world in that regard.
When I was reading this, I thought she was British at the time. And I thought, well, it's just probably different, but she's American.
Yeah, she's American.
She should understand this.
Right. Yeah, it was weird to me. Like it comes off little ivory tower.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you go to any archaeological conference, the majority of people there are either working professors or working in academics, but they don't
working in labs
or working in labs or working in cultural resource management firms, you know? So it just came off as a little pinky in the air. I don't know.
Yeah. But yeah, she describes some features of archaeology pretty clearly here. She mentions field walking, which I've always called field survey.
Yeah, we just called it reconnaissance.
Yeah,
recon.
But basically you get in equally spaced lines and walk the space, whatever you're covering. We were often doing like pipeline corridors and stuff when we were in CRM, so we had a very clear pipeline to follow. Then it gets to how does space archaeology work? And she mentions everything has a unique color signature like a hand signature, which felt like a very strange metaphor to me.
Yeah.
Because my understanding of this is every element makes its own unique color, just our eyes aren't equipped to necessarily distinguish between the different colors of tree leaves and stuff, aren't necessarily something we can see.
Right.
But with technology, we can actually see in those spectrums, or we can see beyond into like the infrared and ultraviolet spectrums. Right. Now, I ran this understanding by a friend who's actually in some space science and stuff, and he said that's kind of right.
Okay.
So
let me guess, it's more complicated.
It's more complicated, go figure, right? But maybe that's a use for working forward on how this actually works, because we're looking at such minute different shades of green that we can't visibly see it, but the machines can help us see it.
Okay.
That's how I understand it anyway.
Okay.
And if someone wants to clarify more, they are welcome to.
Yes. I do like how she goes through and talks a little bit about the origins of the word or the phrase space archaeology, because it is kind of a misnomer. Like, I do think it, because I've talked to other people about space archaeology and they think it's like, oh, like all the dead space debris from all our space exploration,
or
people
aliens.
are starting to study that. And I'm like, no, it's just using satellites.
Yeah.
And they're like, but wait, that's like.
I do that every day.
Right. Well, like, but one of my friends was like, okay, so then can I call using my GPS space navigation? And I was like, touche. But it is, I mean, I think satellite archaeology or something like that would be a more appropriate term.
But it is a term that NASA came up with and it's apparently stuck. So,
yeah, thanks, NASA.
Yeah, way to go. Go figure, the space guys.
Right.
We do get a little bit of the Diane Chase and Arlen Chase example. Once again, we have talked about this quite a bit in The Lost City of the Monkey God, Chapter 8. And this is the pretty famous example, I think, where they actually had been working on some Mayan sites for decades, and then they did LiDAR, and then they've discovered maybe a tenth of what was there or something like that.
Yeah, they were like, oh my gosh,
yeah,
all this work, and now it's just made so easy.
And the person who did the LiDAR was John Weishampel, I want to say, which I noted because he's from the University of Central Florida, so Florida represent.
Which several of our colleagues are PF graduates.
Yeah, and I love the descriptions of Arlen Chase in particular. They're like totally geeking out over the results. Like, an expletive was mentioned when he saw it for the first time, and then Diane said the next day he hasn't eaten dinner, hasn't eaten breakfast, he didn't even go to bed last night. He's been so obsessed with working on this because he's so excited about it. Like, okay, that seems pretty legit.
It's such your whole life's work, and all of a sudden you can just see it there on a screen sitting before you, and
so
all
much
these
more.
sites.
And what is this? And what is this? And what is this? So many questions now, right?
Right.
Yeah. We get a little more into the history of how this developed with aerial photography, World War I balloons is where it actually kind of started, and
Yeah,
then
it has
moved on from there.
like a lot of our technology, it has its origins in military,
Yeah.
which makes sense.
Interestingly, there was actually, before the war, there was someone who was in a balloon, they're sure testing it, and took some photos of Stonehenge.
Oh, yeah.
And this kind of, because people could, for the first time, see the whole landscape. They could see patterns and they could see things they couldn't see otherwise.
Which it's so weird to me to think that, like, because like I said, we used aerial photos as
Right.
maps. To think that there was a time before people did that is very weird.
Yeah.
Because it's such second nature to us.
That was a new concept.
Yeah.
It was wild. Yeah. So some of the first satellite data they have is actually from spy satellites in the Cold War era.
Yeah.
And I thought this particularly stood out because they apparently had a specialized plane that was designed to fly and catch the ejected film from these spy satellites.
That's crazy.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That is so fascinating. I wonder how successful they were, if they, maybe they had a low success rate or something.
Yeah, that's one. Yeah, I wonder. I thought it was interesting, that a lot of this technology obviously was developed like in the 1950s, and it was a lot of it. The data set was declassified in 1995 by President Clinton. That's not that long ago, really.
No, there's a reason this hasn't been taken off until fairly recently.
And she goes into a lot, like if you're a space nerd, satellite nerd, whatever. She goes into a lot about like the different satellites and the different technology, Corona or Lanyard, Argon, all these different spy satellite programs that were used that we can now use for archaeology.
And then I think the end here is we get down to the iChronos tech that happened not that long ago, 1999, I think, which goes down to 1 meter resolution, which is pretty. So 1 pixel is 1 meter, I think.
Yeah, 1 meter.
Which is pretty wild. Some of the reasons some of these satellite things are so important is because they were very, very cheap or free to access.
Well, and I can think of an example when you and I used it recently. We went out and visited that cemetery that was heavily wooded. And as we were walking through, we were like, hey, there's this weird little kind of low-lying area. It looks like a roadbed. And so we're in Leon County, and they have all their GIS available online. I went on. They actually have this really cool slide feature on their maps. And I looked, and I went back, and I looked at various aerial photographs and found that road. And by looking at aerial photographs that were about 10-year increments going back, I was able to figure out when that road was put in and stuff. So, I mean, it has a lot of uses for archaeological and historical research. And it is something that we actually use.
Yeah. And then to kind of get around towards the end here, she does have a little story about visiting some sites in Cambodia with the Khmer Empire.
Yeah.
Again, this is something that we've covered elsewhere. We covered it in Four Lost Cities, Chapter 7. And she definitely does not go into the same detail that book does. So if you want to know more about this, then check that book out. But essentially, they relied on seasonal rains and routing that water and retaining that water. And eventually that kind of fell to pieces because of climate change and other stressors as well.
Yeah.
But it was kind of cool to come back around to that after so long. And then we talk about maybe the near future of this tech. Drones are changing it quite dramatically, with LiDAR in particular. And we might hit, she says maybe someday we'll hit sub 1 inch resolution.
Yeah, and she talks about the reason why drones haven't quite taken off the same as like satellite imagery, just because they're banned in certain places.
Or need permits and stuff.
Yeah.
Which, companies can do, but definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
And then she does finish by saying the pyramids are great and all, but real archaeology is in the more mundane, which is definitely something you've heard us talk about before. And I will say that I think that this book does that pretty well, is talking about the mundane and how interesting and fascinating that is.
Yeah, and I know she also talks about like how, the glitz and the gold and stuff like that. Like, yeah, it's pretty to look at, but...
And it has even purpose for archaeology in that it gets us funding.
Yeah.
But that is kind of not necessarily to our benefit either.
Right. It doesn't show the everyday people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think of the book so far, Barbara?
Jury's out.
Yeah.
I like it, but I feel like it's not quite what I expected. And I think part of that is just because I know this stuff. I know a lot of this stuff. So I'm like, okay, when are we going to get to the cool stuff that I don't really necessarily know about? Like satellite imagery, like I know we use it, so
Right.
I'm just wanting to get to some of the technology that maybe I'm not as familiar with. I don't know. And like I said, a lot of the chapters so far kind of almost seem unfocused.
Yes. And I can't tell how much of that is, like you said, some of the problem could be maybe I know a little too much.
Yeah.
So I know there's more to talk about with what we can learn from teeth, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean that she needs to be talking about that, but I have I still think that raised questions, and I felt like it could have used at least a cursory answer.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's a pleasant enough read.
Yeah.
And there's nothing overtly wrong with it. I think it isn't representative of archaeology as most archaeologists experience it.
Right. Yeah, which is a little weird to me.
But it talks like it is sometimes.
Yeah. I think she's coming from her perspective, and I think she's under the assumption that this is
the standard.
Yeah.
And it's really not.
Right.
So as to compare it directly so far to the book that shall not be named, Lost City of the Monkey God, folks.
Oh, it's a lot better.
It's a lot better than that. Ethically, it's a lot better.
Yeah, she hits on some of the stuff ethically that I wish we would have seen in Lost City of the Monkey God. But
I do see some signs of things that make me wonder a little bit. Like, she talks about, like, it's just her and a couple people out on a project, and she's got a local dig crew. I'm like, okay, so they're the archaeologists too then, but they aren't talked about like they're the archaeologists too. If you have people digging on the site, they should be archaeologists. They may not be specialists.
Right.
But the specialists are the only ones that are archaeologists sometimes. But then I will also say she does an excellent job of naming a lot of people that the other book would not have named.
And at least she's hiring
right.
locals. I mean, sheesh.
Yeah, that was definitely one of our major beefs there, wasn't it?
Yes.
And then I also noted that she mentioned, I'll use the word lost, but they were in quotes.
Right, yes.
Which...
And she didn't go into like super detail, but she did kind of allude to the fact that they are, like you said, in quotes, lost city.
And she doesn't mention every time that, locals knew this was there, but she does give us a really good example, I think, in the next episode. We'll get a good example of that. So I think I at least appreciate that that's acknowledged.
Yeah.
So, yeah, still a little on the fence on this one. Definitely don't hate it, but it's maybe not quite what I was hoping for on some level too. We'll find out.
Right.
And we'll find out next time.
Happy reading, everybody.